The waterline keeps falling, and with it, a set of assumptions that once defined the modern American West. Along the pale, mineral-stained walls of Lake Mead, the so-called bathtub ring has become a visual ledger of loss, marking how far the reservoir has receded from the levels that engineers once considered normal. Behind it stands Hoover Dam, a structure built in an era of confidence that rivers could be measured, controlled, and allocated with precision. That confidence is now under sustained pressure. How did a system designed to tame scarcity become defined by it? What happens when the river feeding one of the largest reservoirs in North America no longer delivers what the system expects? And why are some of the most serious proposals to stabilize it rarely discussed outside technical and policy circles? The reservoir, when full, stretches roughly 112 miles, or about 180 kilometers in length, holding more than 28 million acre-feet of water, equivalent to approximately 34.5 cubic kilometers. That capacity was once treated as a buffer against variability. Today, it is an indicator of vulnerability. Prolonged drought conditions across the Colorado River Basin, combined with long-term climatic shifts and sustained withdrawals, have reduced inflows to levels that no longer match the system's legal and operational assumptions. The imbalance is structural. Water is being allocated based on historical flows that are significantly higher than what recent decades have delivered. The urgency surrounding the reservoir is not simply about water levels. It is about the cascading dependencies tied to it. The dam generates hydroelectric power for millions of people. It regulates downstream flows critical to agriculture and urban supply. It anchors a network of agreements that distribute water across multiple states and tribal jurisdictions. As water levels decline, each of these functions becomes harder to maintain simultaneously. At certain thresholds, the system does not just degrade, it begins to fail in discrete ways. Intake structures lose efficiency. Power generation drops. Delivery commitments become increasingly difficult to meet. The most immediate and actively pursued response does not involve a single dramatic intervention. Instead, it is centered on rewriting how the river system itself is managed. Federal agencies and basin stakeholders are working toward a new operational framework to replace existing guidelines that expire after the current agreement period. These negotiations aim to recalibrate allocations based on actual hydrological conditions rather than historical averages. The approach includes shared shortages across states, meaning that reductions are distributed rather than concentrated. It also incorporates more flexible storage rules between Lake Mead and Lake Powell, allowing water to be moved strategically to preserve system functionality. This shift toward cooperative conservation reflects a recognition that the existing framework is no longer tenable. The original allocation system was designed during an unusually wet period in the early 20th century. It assumed a level of river flow that has not been consistently observed in recent decades. As a result, the system has been over-allocated for years, with total promised withdrawals exceeding average supply. The current negotiations attempt to correct that mismatch without triggering widespread disruption. They rely on a combination of voluntary reductions, compensated conservation, and adaptive management strategies that can respond to changing conditions. Parallel to these policy adjustments is a more structural idea that has gained attention in engineering and hydrological circles. Known informally as the one dam concept, it proposes a fundamental redesign of how storage is distributed within the system. Instead of maintaining two major reservoirs, the idea is to consolidate primary storage in Lake Mead while reducing or potentially eliminating reliance on Lake Powell. The rationale is rooted in efficiency. Two large reservoirs increase surface area, which in turn increases evaporation losses. In a region where evaporation rates are high, this represents a significant and continuous loss of stored water. By concentrating storage in a single reservoir, the system could reduce these losses and simplify operational complexity. Water that would otherwise be spread across two large bodies would instead be held in one, potentially preserving more volume over time. However, implementing this concept would require extensive legal and infrastructural changes. Existing agreements are built around the dual reservoir system. Altering that structure would involve renegotiating water rights, modifying dam operations, and addressing downstream impacts. The technical feasibility of the concept is not the primary barrier. The challenge lies in governance and coordination across multiple jurisdictions. Another set of proposals looks beyond optimizing existing infrastructure and toward expanding it. Historically, there have been plans to construct additional dams within the basin, including projects like the Bridge Canyon Dam. Such a structure would create a new reservoir capable of storing millions of acre-feet of water while also generating hydroelectric power. It could provide an additional buffer against variability and support water delivery to growing urban centers. The technical aspects of building a new dam are well understood. Engineering methods for large-scale water storage have been refined over decades. The constraints are primarily environmental and political. Many of the remaining viable sites for large dams are located in areas with significant ecological or cultural value. Construction would involve altering river ecosystems, inundating land, and potentially affecting protected regions. These factors have limited the viability of new dam projects, despite their potential benefits in terms of storage and energy generation. At the far end of the spectrum are proposals that extend beyond the basin entirely. These involve transferring water from distant river systems into the Colorado River Basin through large-scale diversion projects. Concepts have included pipelines or canals drawing from Northern California rivers or even the Mississippi River. The engineering requirements for such projects are immense. They would involve constructing hundreds or even thousands of miles of conveyance infrastructure, along with the pumping systems needed to move water across varying elevations. While technically possible, these projects are defined by their scale and cost. Financial estimates run into tens or hundreds of billions of dollars depending on the configuration. They also raise complex legal questions about water rights across different basins and states. Transferring water from one region to another introduces competing interests and potential conflicts that extend beyond engineering considerations. As a result, these proposals remain in the realm of long-term possibilities rather than near-term solutions. More immediate gains may come from improving how existing reservoirs are managed. Advances in computational modeling and control systems have enabled more sophisticated approaches to reservoir operation. By using predictive analytics and real-time data, operators can coordinate releases between Lake Mead and Lake Powell to optimize both water storage and power generation. Simulations have shown that such approaches can increase energy output by around 10%, while also improving the reliability of water deliveries. These systems work by anticipating inflows, demand patterns, and evaporation rates, then adjusting operations accordingly. Instead of reacting to conditions as they occur, the system can act proactively, preserving water during periods of surplus and releasing it strategically during shortages. This level of coordination requires integration across multiple agencies and jurisdictions, but it does not require new physical infrastructure. It represents a way to extract more performance from the system as it currently exists. Engineering modifications to Hoover Dam itself are also part of the response. As water levels decline, the dam's intake structures face limitations. To address this, projects have been proposed or implemented to extend the operational range of the dam. These include constructing lower-level intake tunnels and installing additional pumping systems that can draw water even when the reservoir drops below traditional thresholds. Such measures ensure continued water delivery and, to some extent, power generation under lower water conditions. However, these modifications do not address the underlying issue of supply. They are designed to maintain functionality rather than increase available water. In effect, they extend the operational lifespan of the existing system, under declining conditions. This distinction is critical. It highlights the difference between adapting to scarcity and resolving it. Another operational strategy involves redistributing water between reservoirs to minimize losses. By shifting storage in response to seasonal and climatic conditions, operators can reduce evaporation and improve overall efficiency. For example, storing more water in a reservoir with lower evaporation rates during certain periods can preserve volume that would otherwise be lost. This approach requires detailed modeling and coordination, but can be implemented within the existing framework. The energy dimension of the system introduces additional complexity. If water levels fall below the threshold required for hydropower generation at Hoover Dam, alternative energy sources must compensate for the loss. Plans have been developed to replace or supplement hydropower with solar and wind generation. There is also research into hybrid systems, including floating solar installations on reservoir surfaces. These systems could generate electricity while also reducing evaporation by shading the water below. Such approaches address the energy aspect of the system independently of water levels. They ensure that power supply remains stable even if the reservoir cannot support traditional generation. However, like the engineering modifications to the dam, they do not increase water availability. They mitigate the consequences of declining levels rather than reversing them. Efforts to increase water supply directly have focused on methods such as cloud seeding and snowpack enhancement in the upper basin. These techniques aim to increase precipitation or retain snow for longer periods, thereby boosting runoff into the river system. While these methods are grounded in established science, their impact is relatively limited. They can provide incremental gains, but are unlikely to offset the scale of the deficit between supply and demand. Taken together, these approaches illustrate the breadth of responses being considered and implemented. They range from incremental adjustments to existing operations to large-scale reconfigurations of the system. Each addresses a different aspect of the problem, whether it is storage efficiency, infrastructure resilience, or energy stability. Yet none of them, individually or collectively, can fully compensate for the fundamental imbalance between water supply and demand in the Colorado River Basin. The decline of Lake Mead is not the result of a single factor that can be corrected with a single solution. It is the outcome of a system designed under assumptions that no longer hold, operating in an environment that has shifted in measurable ways. The proposals under consideration reflect an attempt to adapt that system to new conditions without dismantling it entirely. Some aim to optimize what exists. Others propose building new structures or even redefining the system itself. All operate within constraints imposed by geography, law, and economics. As negotiations continue and projects move from concept to implementation, the effectiveness of these measures will depend on how they interact with one another. A more flexible management framework can enhance the benefits of advanced reservoir optimization. Infrastructure modifications can extend the utility of policy changes. Large-scale projects, if pursued, could alter the baseline conditions under which the system operates. The challenge lies in aligning these elements into a coherent strategy that addresses both immediate needs and long-term sustainability. The remaining question is not whether solutions exist, but how they will be combined, prioritized, and executed under conditions that continue to evolve. The system is already being reshaped through incremental decisions and targeted interventions. Whether those changes will be sufficient to stabilize it or merely delay more significant disruptions remains tied to factors that extend beyond engineering and into the realm of long-term resource balance. The structural imbalance defining the decline of Lake Mead becomes more apparent when the full accounting of water use across the Colorado River Basin is examined against actual inflows over the past 2 decades. Average annual natural flow, once estimated at roughly 15 million acre-feet, or about 18.5 cubic kilometers, has trended significantly lower in recent years, often closer to 12 million acre-feet, or about 14.8 cubic kilometers, with some years dropping further. Meanwhile, total allocations on paper still exceed these reduced averages, creating a persistent deficit that is absorbed by reservoir storage. This gap is the central driver behind the falling elevation levels at both Lake Mead and Lake Powell. As reservoir elevations approach critical thresholds, operational constraints become more rigid. At approximately 1,050 feet, or about 320 meters above sea level, Hoover Dam begins to lose significant hydropower generation efficiency. At even lower elevations, below what is often termed minimum power pool, turbines can no longer operate effectively. Further decline toward 1,000 feet, or about 305 meters, introduces risks to water delivery infrastructure where intakes must rely on auxiliary systems to maintain flow. These thresholds are not theoretical markers, they define real operational limits that have already influenced emergency planning and infrastructure upgrades. The cumulative response has increasingly shifted towards system-wide coordination rather than isolated fixes. One of the more technically grounded developments is the expansion of integrated reservoir modeling that treats Lake Mead and Lake Powell as components of a single dynamic system rather than independent storage units. By synchronizing release schedules and storage targets, operators can reduce inefficiencies that arise when reservoirs are managed in isolation. This includes minimizing unnecessary transfers that expose water to additional evaporation cycles and optimizing release timing to align with downstream demand peaks. Simulated implementations of these coordinated systems have demonstrated measurable improvements. Energy output gains on the order of 10% have been observed under certain scenarios, while delivery reliability increases through more stable storage levels. The mechanism behind these gains is not increased water availability, but improved timing and allocation. By reducing operational friction, the system extracts more utility from each unit of water stored and released. This approach, while less visible than large infrastructure projects, represents one of the more immediately deployable strategies. At the same time, the concept of redistributing storage between reservoirs continues to be evaluated as part of broader planning. Seasonal and climatic variability across the basin means that evaporation rates are not uniform. Lake Mead, located at a lower elevation and in a hotter desert environment, experiences higher evaporation losses compared to Lake Powell. However, Lake Powell has its own structural limitations, including sediment accumulation and operational constraints tied to downstream delivery obligations. The redistribution strategy seeks to balance these competing factors by shifting storage in response to projected conditions, effectively treating evaporation as a controllable variable within the system. The one dam concept extends this logic to its end point by proposing the elimination of dual storage entirely. Consolidating water into Lake Mead would reduce total surface area and therefore evaporation losses, potentially preserving hundreds of thousands of acre-feet or several 100 million cubic meters annually under certain conditions. However, this consolidation would also concentrate risk. Any operational issue at a single reservoir would have system-wide implications. Additionally, the transition to a single reservoir system would require managing the drawdown of Lake Powell, including sediment exposure and ecological impacts along previously submerged areas. Beyond reservoir management, infrastructure adaptation remains a critical component. Modifications to Hoover Dam have focused on extending its operational envelope. Lower intake systems and auxiliary pumping stations are designed to function even as water levels approach previously unusable ranges. These interventions effectively redefine the minimum operating level of the reservoir, allowing continued water extraction below traditional thresholds. Similar considerations apply to upstream infrastructure, where dam outlets and spillways must be evaluated for performance under reduced head conditions. However, these engineering solutions introduce additional energy costs. Pumping water from lower elevations requires external power input, partially offsetting the loss of hydropower generation from the dam itself. This creates a feedback loop in which declining water levels reduce energy production while simultaneously increasing energy demand for water delivery. Addressing this imbalance has led to parallel planning for energy substitution. Solar and wind generation capacity across the southwestern United States has expanded significantly, providing a potential replacement for lost hydropower. In some configurations, hybrid systems are being evaluated, including floating solar installations on reservoir surfaces. These systems can generate electricity while also reducing evaporation by shading portions of the water surface. Preliminary studies suggest that even partial coverage could yield measurable reductions in evaporation rates, though large-scale deployment would require addressing structural, environmental, and maintenance challenges. More extreme proposals, such as inter-basin water transfers, remain technically feasible but operationally distant. Concepts involving pipelines from the Mississippi River or diversions from Northern California river systems would require infrastructure on a scale comparable to or exceeding existing national water projects. Elevation differences alone necessitate extensive pumping, with associated energy requirements that would rival those of major metropolitan areas. Financial costs are correspondingly high, often estimated in the range of tens of billions of dollars or more. Legal frameworks governing water rights across state lines add another layer of complexity, as do environmental considerations tied to altering flow regimes in source basins. Even if such projects were implemented, their contribution would need to be evaluated against the scale of the deficit. Transferring 1 million acre-feet, or about 1.2 cubic kilometers annually, would represent a significant engineering achievement, yet it would address only a portion of the existing gap between supply and demand. This illustrates the magnitude of the challenge. Incremental additions to supply, while beneficial, do not fundamentally resolve the imbalance unless paired with corresponding reductions in consumption. If you want more deep-dive breakdowns like this, covering the hidden systems, the real numbers, and the solutions most people never hear about, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and tap that hype icon to help this reach a wider audience.